Autonomy. An idea which seems so simple, that is, until you actually take the time and reflect upon it. What is autonomy? Can one ever really be autonomous? And if so, what does that mean? The idea of autonomy is a relatively modern construct, initially becoming a matter of intellectual interest during the Enlightenment era of the 18th century with contributions from philosophers such as Immanuel Kant. Within our society, the idea of autonomy tends to be reduced to nothing more than the mere act of making choices by oneself for oneself. However, there is far more to autonomy than modern society would lead you to believe. There is often confusion regarding the difference between autonomy and freedom. While freedom concerns merely the ability to act without external or internal constraints, autonomy concerns the independence and authenticity of the desires that move one to act in the first place. There are even distinctions which must be made regarding various fundamental forms of autonomy. Moral autonomy refers to the capacity to impose the objective moral law on oneself. According to Immanuel Kant's philosophical ideas regarding the concept of moral autonomy, it is the individual that is responsible for placing various moral obligations upon themselves, as while external forces may influence them, it is ultimately the decision of the individual of which moral law he or she shall follow. However, Kant stipulates that in order for an action to be morally justified, it must be able to be willed to be a universal law. This means that in order for a law or action to be moral on an individual level, said law or action must be able to be applied to all individuals while not leading to an undesirable world. Consider the act of stealing an ice cream cone. No sane individual would wish to live in a world in which everyone stole ice cream cones from one another, as that would lead to an undesirable result. And thus the act of stealing an ice cream cone is immoral on an individual level. Personal autonomy, on the other hand, refers to a trait that individuals can exhibit relative to any aspect of their lives and is not limited to questions of moral obligation. Let us now examine the characters of Romeo and Juliet in regards to the level of personal autonomy. Upon first impressions, it would appear as if both Juliet and Romeo exhibit a great deal of personal autonomy. They seem to act without restraint or restrictions imposed by external forces. However, are they truly autonomous agents, or are they simply unsupervised, irrational agents? In examining this, we must examine the true nature of personal autonomy. One's level of personal autonomy is determined by far more than the level of restriction which is imposed by external governmental or authoritative forces, as it also pertains to an individual's emotional influences, motives, beliefs, and past experiences which shape their current person and thus act as independent forces from the agent himself. However, great difficulty lies in determining such factors, as there is no identifiable set of terms with which we can distinguish the powers that bully the agent from the powers that can be attributed to the agent himself. There are several approaches to the idea of personal autonomy, each with their distinct differences in the requirements for the establishment of such autonomy. However, each approach is similar in that they do not necessarily refer to the action itself, but more so the motives behind it. Also, each approach to the idea of personal autonomy is based on the fact that, in order to be, by definition, autonomous, one's actions must be a result of their individual ability to govern themselves. However, what these approaches to autonomy also incorporate is the idea that some influences which we may tend to consider as part of the agent are, in fact, independent in nature, and are thus preventing the agent from fully governing themselves or becoming an autonomous agent. The first approach to the idea of personal autonomy can be referred to as the coherentist approach. This approach states that an agent governs their actions and thus acts autonomously, if and only if their motives cohere with some attitude that represents their point of view on the action. So as long as the agent acts in a way which is in accordance with their genuine beliefs and desires, then said agent acts autonomously. For example, if a drug addict would rather resist the irresistible urge to take drugs, yet continues to take them, then they would be failing to govern themselves and thus not be acting autonomously. However, if they had no objection to their addiction and its effects, then they would be considered to be acting autonomously, as their motives still cohere with their point of view on the action. The second approach to autonomy can be referred to as the reason's responsiveness conception, as it is entirely dependent on one's ability to respond to the reasons behind an individualistic motive. This approach states that an agent does not truly govern themselves unless their motives or the mental processes that produce them are responsive to a sufficiently wide range of reasons for and against behaving as they might. What this is saying is that if an individual does not or cannot understand the reasons and morality behind their motives, or is unable to respond to such reasons, then said agent is not qualified to govern themselves, and thus cannot act autonomously. The third approach to personal autonomy can be referred to as the responsiveness to reasoning conception, and it directly builds off of the reason responsiveness approach. While the reason responsiveness approach focused on an agent's ability to understand and respond to the various reasons which may compel them to act, the responsiveness to reasoning approach pertains to the actual act of reflecting upon and evaluating one's motives. This approach claims that the true essence of self-government is the capacity to evaluate one's motives on the basis of an individual's genuine beliefs and desires, and to adjust these motives in response to their evaluation. While this idea of personal autonomy does state that the key to true autonomous agency is the ability to distance oneself from their own attitudes, beliefs, and emotions, because motives which are authorized from this point are entirely internal to the agent himself, it also allows for the agent to draw inferences from what it is they may want or believe. As such, one may still exercise this capacity to reflect despite holding false beliefs as long as they exist solely as a result of the individual agent. However, if the agent is in the grip of compulsion, addiction, or under strong external influence, then whatever facts they consider or conclusions they draw cannot be attributed to them, and thus their reasoning does not guarantee their autonomy as it is under the control of external forces. In addition to this, the responsiveness to reasoning account requires an autonomous agent to be able to change their mind when they discover good reason to do so, and as such act accordingly on a new set of motives. And so, even if an agent is capable of reflecting upon their motives, if they remain unable to change said motives, then they are unable to exist autonomously. The fourth and final approach to personal autonomy which I will cover can be referred to as the incompatibilist conception of autonomy. This approach is fairly simplistic in that it merely states that autonomous actions cannot be determined by events which are external to the agent themselves. If one's actions can be explained as the effect of external powers, then even if his or her beliefs and attitudes are among these effects, then he or she do not govern them, and thus do not govern themselves. This means that they would be unable to be considered an autonomous agent under the incompatibilist approach. Let us now re-examine the characters of Romeo and Juliet in regards to their degree of true personal autonomy. In asking oneself whether or not Romeo and Juliet are in fact autonomous beings, they must consider one inescapable fact, being that it is unclear whether or not their emotions, beliefs, and motives are genuinely representative of their individual persons. Romeo and Juliet are undeniably acting under the influence of sudden emotion and external stimuli, meaning that under the incompatibilist approach they would be, by definition, not autonomous, as they are acting under motives which are derived from emotions that were instilled within them by an external force. However, if Romeo and Juliet's emotions and perceptions are genuinely representative of their individual self, then, following the coherentist approach, they would be autonomous. It is for this reason that the answer to the question of whether or not Romeo and Juliet are truly autonomous must be left at a resounding maybe. For if one perceives their love and thus their emotion to be a genuine result of solely their own person, then they would be governing themselves based upon their own individual point of view and thus be considered autonomous. However, if their love is not genuine, then they would be acting under the influence of an external force which is independent of themselves, and thus they could not be considered autonomous.